A businessman ignores an injured elderly woman on the street, leaving her alone. Years later, he loses everything and takes a job at a powerful company. There he discovers his boss is the same woman he once ignored. Now he must face his past and prove he can change. The rain battered New York that June night, turning Park Avenue into a river of black umbrellas and foggy headlights. From the top of the most imposing corporate building in the area, Richard Thompson observed the city with the same expression of superiority that had become his trademark over the past 15 years. The cocktail party for the inauguration of the new financial center had been an absolute success. As always, Richard had been the center of attention, surrounded by businessmen, politicians, and socialites vying for a few minutes of his time. At 45, he personified success, president of the largest investment group in the country, a fortune estimated in billions, and a reputation for business acumen that made him both admired and feared. "Mr. Thompson, your car is ready," announced his assistant Emily, interrupting his thoughts. "And you have that video conference with Hong Kong in 2 hours." Richard adjusted the knot of his Italian tie and picked up his leather briefcase. "Cancel the conference. Tell them an urgent matter came up," he replied without looking at Emily, who was already accustomed to his sudden schedule changes. As he descended in the private elevator, Richard mentally reviewed the numbers from the last quarter. His group had just finalized a historic acquisition, incorporating 3 smaller companies in a move that the specialized media called the masterstroke of the year. What no one knew was that those companies had been systematically devalued through a complex financial operation orchestrated by him. The building's lobby was practically empty at that hour. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor as he walked toward the exit, where his private driver waited with an umbrella. The rain had intensified, and gusts of wind made the water droplets dance in the air like tiny crystals. That's when he saw her. An elderly woman around 70 years old had fallen on the sidewalk a few meters from the building's entrance. Her shopping bags were scattered on the wet ground, and she was struggling unsuccessfully to get up while leaning on a bench. Richard paused for a moment. Through the glass wall, he could clearly see the woman's distressed face. For a split second, he was reminded of his own grandmother, who had raised him after his parents abandoned him. But that uncomfortable memory was quickly suppressed by years of conditioning to succeed at any cost. "Andrew, let's go. I'm running late," he said to the driver, who hesitated for a moment, glancing from the woman to his boss. "But sir, she seems to need help." "That's not our problem." "There must be some security around here," Richard cut in, getting into the imported car. Through the rearview mirror, he saw a young man in a red delivery uniform running toward the lady. "See, someone's already going to help." As the car glided through the wet streets of New York, Richard checked his messages. One in particular caught his attention. It was from Charles Augustus, his main partner for over a decade. "We need to talk urgently, delicate matter." Richard smirked with disdain. Charles had always been the weakest link in the partnership, always worried about ethical issues and social responsibility. He was probably nervous about some detail of the latest acquisition. Nothing a firm conversation couldn't fix. The Porsche car stopped in front of his penthouse in the Upper East Side. Richard dismissed the driver and went straight up to his private office. The view of the city at night, usually his favorite moment of the day, felt different. Something was bothering him, like a distant noise he couldn't quite place. He poured himself a 30-year-old whiskey and sat in his leather armchair. On the coffee table, that week's issue of Forbes featured his photo on the cover with the headline, "The King of Hearts of the Financial Market." The article described him as a business genius and an example of modern capitalism. His phone rang again. It was Charles Augustus for the 3rd time. Richard huffed in irritation and answered, "Charles, it's almost 11 at night. What could be so urgent?" The voice on the other end sounded tense, almost unrecognizable. "Richard, they've found out everything. The offshore operations, the shell companies, the devaluation scheme, it's all documented. The SEC will open an investigation tomorrow." The glass of whiskey slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. Richard felt his blood run cold. "What do you mean they found out? Who?" "I don't know, but someone handed over a complete dossier to the authorities. Richard, This is going to destroy everything we've built." For the first time in many years, Richard Thompson felt fear. A visceral fear that paralyzed him in his armchair as the rain continued to pound against the windows of his penthouse. From the height of his empire, he couldn't imagine that this night would mark the beginning of his downfall, and that the elderly woman on the sidewalk, whom he had refused to help, would be just the first piece in an elaborate chess game about to unfold. That night, as the city slept under the storm, fate began to weave its web of consequences. And Richard Thompson, in his arrogance, still didn't know that he was about to learn the hardest lesson of his life. The following days turned into a nightmare for Richard Thompson. The headlines of the newspapers, which once celebrated his success, now bore words like fraud and investigation. The empire he had built over 15 years was crumbling like a house of cards, and every hour brought a new, devastating revelation. The boardroom, once his territory of absolute power, now felt like a hostile arena. The same faces that had smiled and agreed with his every word just a week ago now stared at him with a mix of disdain and accusation. Charles Augustus, his former partner, led the emergency meeting that would seal his fate. "The shareholders are demanding your immediate removal, Richard," declared Charles, avoiding eye contact. "We have no choice. The company's reputation is at stake." Richard adjusted himself in his chair, feeling the weight of every gaze upon him. "You can't do this. I built this company from the ground up, without me. With fraud and manipulation," interrupted one of the advisors, Beatrice Turner, who had always discreetly opposed his methods. "The documents are irrefutable. We're lucky if we can save the company after this." The meeting dragged on for hours, but the outcome had been decided even before it began. Richard was stripped of all his positions. His assets were frozen by the courts and his accounts were seized. Within days, the man who had personified business success in the United States found himself cut off from his resources and facing a flood of lawsuits. Emily, his loyal assistant for so many years, entered his office for the last time as he gathered his personal belongings. "Mr. Thompson, I'm so sorry," she said hesitantly. "I never imagined that I would fall," he finished with a bitter smile. "Neither did I, Emily. Neither did I." As he left the building that had once been his kingdom, Richard noticed people avoiding his gaze. The security guards, who once bent over backward to show respect, now barely concealed their mocking smiles. In the parking lot, his private driver was no longer there. The luxury car had already been reclaimed by the company. At home, the situation was no better. His wife, Teresa, had left, taking almost everything with her, leaving only a cold note. "I didn't marry a fraud. My lawyers will be in touch." The penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a mausoleum of his lofty ambitions. The weeks dragged on in a blur of court hearings, meetings with lawyers, and futile attempts to reach out to old friends. Every person who ignored him, every door that closed, was a painful reminder of how his world had changed. On a particularly difficult afternoon, as he walked down the same block where he used to park his Ferrari, Richard passed a newsstand. His face still graced the covers, but now accompanied by headlines that destroyed him. It was then that he noticed a familiar face on one of the magazines. It was Eleanor Grand, CEO of Grand Corp, one of the largest multinationals in the country. The article spoke about how she had transformed the company into a global giant without compromising ethical values. Richard picked up the magazine, his hands trembling slightly. Something in Eleanor's photo unsettled him, as if there was a connection he couldn't quite place. Her piercing eyes seemed to stare right through the page, as if they knew something. He didn't. That night in his increasingly empty apartment, the bailiffs took something new every week. Richard began researching Grand Corp. It was a company known for its unique culture and solid values, something he had always dismissed as marketing for the naive. But now, with nothing left to lose, he started to see things from a different angle. It was then that he found a senior analyst position posted on the company's website. The salary was a ridiculously small fraction of what he used to earn, and the role was far below his qualifications. In another time, he would have laughed at such an opportunity. But now, with his bank accounts frozen and creditors knocking at his door, It felt like a beacon in the darkness. "It's temporary," he told himself as he prepared his resume, strategically, omitting his most recent roles and focusing on his technical skills. "Just until I get back on my feet." What Richard didn't know was that by sending that resume, he was taking the first step on a journey that would change not only his career, but his very essence as a human being. And that Eleanor Grand, the enigmatic CEO whose photo had unsettled him, had very specific plans for his future at the company. The Grand Corp building stood imposingly in the heart of New York's new business district, its glass walls reflecting the morning sun. Richard adjusted his tie, no longer Italian but a modest piece bought on clearance, and took a deep breath before stepping through the revolving doors. It was his first day as a senior analyst, a position he would have considered insignificant just a few months ago. The lobby was unlike anything he had ever seen. Instead of the cold marble and ostentatious decor that characterized his former empire, the space felt welcoming, with natural plants, soft ambient music, and employees who genuinely seemed happy to be there. "Mr. Thompson," a young woman in her early 30s approached with a genuine smile. "I'm Julia Sanders from HR. I'll be guiding you through your first day." During the tour of the building, Richard noticed details that stood out from the traditional corporate mold. There were communal spaces on every floor, a collaborative library, and even a rooftop garden where employees held informal meetings. "Grand Corp has a different philosophy," Julia explained, as if reading his thoughts. "Here, success isn't just measured by numbers, but by the positive impact we create." Richard stifled a skeptical smile. In his experience, this kind of speech was just a facade to please conscious shareholders. But something in Julia's tone suggested genuine conviction. Upon arriving at his new department on the 15th floor, the D, expressions of his future colleagues were not as welcoming as Julia's. Some whispered among themselves, others pretended not to notice his presence. A middle-aged man who introduced himself as Albert Johnson, his new supervisor, greeted him with icy formality. "Your desk is over there," Albert indicated, pointing to a workstation near the window. "The reports I need are in your email. I expect them by the end of the day." As he organized his desk, Richard noticed furtive glances in his direction. A whispered conversation near the water cooler caught his attention. "Is that really him, Richard Thompson, the one who— Shh! They say she personally approved his hiring. But why? After everything The mention of her piqued his curiosity. Eleanor Grand, the enigmatic CEO, was known for rarely interfering in mid-level hires. Why would she take an interest in his admission? When he opened his corporate email, Richard found a surprising amount of reports to analyze. They were complex cases involving strategic decisions that seemed to test ethical judgment as much as technical competence. "Interesting hire," commented a female voice behind him. It was Claire Rogers, a senior analyst who appeared to be around his age. Her tone was friendly, but her eyes conveyed a sharp curiosity. "It's not common to have experienced executives in analytical positions." "Sometimes we need to start over," Richard replied, trying to maintain a neutral tone. "Without a doubt," Claire smiled, "especially when that fresh start is carefully planned." Before Richard could question the meaning of that insinuation, Claire had already walked away. Throughout the day, more strange situations piled up. The cases he was supposed to analyze seemed specifically chosen to test his values. One of them, curiously, involved a decision between maximizing profits or preserving a social project. During lunch in the company cafeteria, Richard sat alone observing the dynamics around him. It was like being in an aquarium where everyone could see him, but no one approached, except for a gentleman who appeared to be over 60 who casually took the seat across from him. "Michael Carter, executive assistant to the president," the man introduced himself, his kind eyes contrasting with an enigmatic expression. "You know, Mr. Thompson, sometimes fate places us exactly where we need to be, even if we don't understand why." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Fate, or someone manipulating it?" Michael smiled, picking up his tray. "Mrs. Grand has an interesting saying about that. She says there are no coincidences, only opportunities for redemption that we pretend not to see." That conversation unsettled Richard for the rest of the day. As he worked on the reports, he began to notice patterns in the cases he was supposed to analyze. All of them involved situations where executives had chosen between personal gain and social responsibility. It was as if someone was setting up an elaborate character test. At the end of the workday, as he packed up his things, Richard noticed an envelope on his desk that hadn't been there before. Inside, there was only a card with a handwritten note. "Sometimes we need to lose everything to find what truly matters." E.g.? He looked around, but the office was practically empty. Through the window, he could see the sun setting over the city, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. Something told him that his hiring at Grand Corp was just the beginning of a much larger story than he could have imagined. And Eleanor Grand, wherever she was, seemed to be moving the pieces of a game he didn't fully understand yet. The weeks at Grand Corp turned into an intriguing puzzle for Richard. Each day brought new situations that seemed carefully orchestrated, as if he were part of an elaborate social experiment. The reports that landed on his desk invariably involved complex decisions, where numbers and humanity intertwined in challenging ways. One particularly hectic morning, Claire Rogers approached his desk with a file in hand. "Richard, I need your opinion on this case," she said, her eyes revealing a curiosity that went beyond the professional. "It's about the Dawn Project." The name of the project caused an immediate buzz in the office. Richard noticed several colleagues trying discreetly to eavesdrop on the conversation. The Dawn Project was one of the company's most controversial initiatives, an urban revitalization effort that was sparking protests in several communities. "Why would my opinion be relevant?" Richard asked, flipping through the file with growing interest. "Let's just say your previous experience with similar situations might be useful," Claire replied with an enigmatic smile. "Besides, Eleanor Grand personally requested your analysis." The mention of the CEO's name made Richard look up from the document. It was the third time that week he had been assigned a task directly linked to her, though he had never met her in person. The coincidences were becoming hard to ignore. As he analyzed the project, Richard discovered something intriguing. Among the documents was an old folder with records of social initiatives the company had developed over 5 years ago. One of them caught his attention. It was a program to assist elderly people in vulnerable situations, focused precisely in the area where he had ignored that woman on the rainy night. "Found something interesting?" asked Michael Carter, appearing silently at his side. The executive assistant had a disconcerting habit of showing up at the most unexpected moments. "This project, why was it discontinued?" Richard questioned. Holding up the documents, Michael adjusted his glasses, his face taking on a thoughtful expression. "Sometimes, Mr. Thompson, the value of an initiative can't be measured solely by spreadsheets. Eleanor learned that the hard way." Before Richard could ask more, Albert Johnson called an emergency meeting. The supervisor seemed more tense than usual, his hands slightly trembling as he handed out the agendas. "The board is concerned about the direction of the Dawn Project," he announced. "We need a solution that balances the company's interests with the demands of the community." During the meeting, Richard noticed something curious. In one of the presentations, there was an old photo of a protest against another company project. Among the protesters, he recognized a face. It was the same young delivery man who had helped the elderly woman that fateful night. "His name is Peter Smith," Claire whispered, noticing his interest in the photo. "He leads a quite influential community movement these days. Funny how paths cross, isn't it?" The coincidence was too unsettling to ignore. Richard began to suspect that every detail of his presence at Grand Corp had been meticulously planned. But why? At the end of the day, while organizing his desk, he found another mysterious note. "The choices we make in the simplest moments reveal who we truly are." E.g. Determined to uncover more, Richard waited for the office to empty and began investigating the company's old files. In a dusty folder, he found something revealing. A detailed report on his own career, including events that even the press hadn't uncovered during his downfall. But what intrigued him the most was a photo attached to the report. In it, Eleanor Grand appeared younger, standing beside an elderly woman who looked strangely familiar. The date of the photo coincided with the time when the Elderly Assistance Project had been initiated. Suddenly, a woman's voice sounded behind him, making him freeze. "I see you found some of our more interesting files, Mr. Thompson." Mendez. As he turned around, Richard came face to face with an elegant woman, around 50 years old, whose piercing eyes he instantly recognized from the photos in the magazines. Eleanor Grand was there, in the flesh, and her smile suggested she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "I think it's time we had a frank conversation about the real reason you were hired," she said, closing the office door behind her. The setting sun cast dramatic shadows through the windows as Richard realized he was about to uncover truths that would completely change his understanding of the past few months. The office fell into a heavy silence as Eleanor Grand settled into the chair across from Richard's desk. The orange glow of the sunset streamed through the windows, creating elongated shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. It was as if the environment itself conspired to make the moment even more dramatic. You know, Mr. Thompson," Eleanor began, her voice calm and controlled, "there are moments in life that define who we are. It's not the big corporate decisions or the headlines in the papers, but the small gestures, the ones we make when we believe no one is watching." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. The folder with his background was still open on the desk, the photo of Eleanor with the elderly woman exposed like silent evidence. "You seem to know a lot about me," he replied, trying to maintain his composure. "More than should be possible." Eleanor smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just as you've discovered a lot about our company in recent days. Interesting how some coincidences seem providential, don't you think?" She stood up, walking over to the window. The New York skyline stretched out before them, a sea of buildings bathed in the golden light of dusk. "That woman in the photo," Eleanor continued, without turning around, "was my mother, Mrs. Amelia. 6 years ago, she had an accident in front of a corporate building. It was raining and she slipped. Several people walked past her, pretending not to see, except for one young delivery man." Richard felt his heart race. The story was all too familiar. "Peter Smith," he murmured, recalling the protester's photo. "Exactly," confirmed Eleanor, turning to face him. "The same Peter who now leads the community movement against the Dawn Project. Funny how life presents us with the same lessons in different ways, don't you think?" Richard began connecting the dots. "So my hiring was carefully planned?" "Yes," Eleanor finished, sitting back down, "but not for the reasons you imagine. You see, Mr. Thompson, when I learned of your story, your fall, I saw a unique opportunity." "Opportunity for what? Revenge?" Eleanor laughed softly, a sound that carried more sadness than amusement. "Revenge is a waste of energy, Mr. Thompson. What I saw was the chance to transform someone who, like many executives I've known, lost touch with what truly matters." She opened her folder and pulled out another document, this one more recent. It was a detailed analysis of the decisions Richard had made since joining the company. "Your analyses of the recent cases were interesting," she commented. "Especially your approach to the Dawn Project. You're starting to see beyond the numbers, even if you won't admit it to yourself yet." Richard picked up the report, flipping through it with growing unease. Every decision he had made had been meticulously documented, every small shift in his thinking recorded. "Why me?" he finally asked. "Of all the disgraced executives, why choose me for your—" "An experiment?" Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes fixed on his. "Because I saw something in you that reminded me of myself years ago. Before I lost my mother, before I understood that success without purpose is just an elegant form of failure." She stood up, preparing to leave, but paused at the door. "The Dawn Project isn't just another venture, Mr. Thompson. It's a chance at redemption, not just for you, but for all of us. Peter Smith will be at tomorrow's meeting, representing the community. It will be interesting to see how you handle this reunion." Richard furrowed his brow. "Reunion? I've never met him personally." "Haven't you?" Eleanor asked with an enigmatic smile. "Perhaps it's time to pay more attention to the faces around you, Mr. Thompson. Sometimes the people we ignore in our moments of arrogance have a peculiar way of reappearing in our lives." With those words, she left, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts and a stack of documents that told a much larger story than he had imagined. Through the window, the last rays of sunlight painted the sky purple, signaling the end of a day that had completely shifted his perspective. As he gathered his things to leave, Richard found another note on his desk. Tomorrow, 9 a.m., main conference room. Sometimes fate gives us a second chance to do the right thing. Don't waste yours. E.g. On his way home, for the first time, in a long while, Richard began to question not only his past choices, but also the man he had become. And on the horizon, the meeting with Peter Smith promised to be just the beginning of a journey of self-discovery he never imagined he would need. The main conference room at Grand Corp was packed that morning. Executives in impeccable suits mingled, with community representatives in simpler attire, creating a visual contrast that perfectly mirrored the conflict about to unfold. Richard arrived a few minutes before 9, strategically choosing a seat near the middle of the oval table. Claire Rogers, seated across from him, gave him a meaningful look. Beside her, Albert Johnson nervously drummed his fingers on the mahogany table. "They're here," announced Michael Carter as he entered the room. Behind him, a group of 5 people walked in. At the front was Peter Smith, no longer wearing a delivery uniform, but dressed in a simple button-up shirt and jeans. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Richard, and for a moment time seemed to freeze. The recognition was mutual and instant. Richard felt his stomach churn as he saw the man who, years ago, had done what he had refused to do: help someone in need. Eleanor Grand entered last, taking the head of the table with a presence that commanded immediate respect. "Good morning, everyone," she began. "We are here to discuss the future of the Dawn Project and its impact on the Hope Gardens community." Peter was the first to speak, his voice calm but firm. "Before we begin, I'd like to share a story with all of you, a story about choices and consequences." Richard noticed Eleanor's gaze on him as Peter continued. "A few years ago, on a rainy night, I was just a delivery driver. I saw an elderly woman lying on the sidewalk in need of help, but before me I also saw a man in an expensive suit step out of his imported car, look at her, and simply walk away." The room fell into absolute silence. Richard could feel cold, sweat trickling down his back. "That night changed my life," Peter went on. "The woman I helped was Mrs. Amelia Grand. She not only recovered but encouraged me to study, to fight for my community. And today I'm here looking into the eyes of the same man who chose not to help her." All eyes turned to Richard. Eleanor remained impassive, watching the scene unfold. "The Dawn Project," Peter continued, "isn't just about buildings and profits. It's about people, about choices, about the kind of society we want to build." Richard stood up slowly, his hands slightly trembling. "Mr. Smith." "Peter, you're right. I was that man. And I carry the weight of that choice every day." A murmur swept through the room. Claire covered her mouth with her hand, while Albert seemed to have completely lost his color. "But today," Richard continued, his voice gaining strength, "I am in a unique position. Someone who has lived on both extremes, someone who understands both, the corporate side and the human cost of our decisions." He opened his briefcase, pulling out a series of documents. "I spent the entire night reviewing the Dawn Project, and I found a way to restructure it, preserving the community's interests without compromising financial viability." Eleanor leaned forward, intrigued, as Richard began to present his proposal. It was a bold plan that included the creation of a community board with real decision-making power, professional training programs, and a social development fund jointly managed by the company and the community. "Impressive," commented Eleanor after the presentation, "but this will significantly reduce our profit margin on the project." "Yes," Richard confirmed, looking her directly in the eye. "But some things are more important than profits. I learned that the hard way." Peter stood up, approaching Richard. "Why should we trust you? Your words?" "They shouldn't," replied Richard, surprising everyone. "Don't take my word for it. Trust my actions from here on out. I'm willing to work directly with the community on the ground to ensure every promise is kept." Eleanor smiled subtly, exchanging a meaningful glance with Michael. It was exactly what she had hoped to hear. "Gentlemen," she announced, standing up, "I believe we have the foundation for a fresh start. Mr. Smith, Mr. Thompson, I'd like the two of you to lead the project's restructuring together." The tension in the room was palpable. Peter and Richard locked eyes for a long moment, decades of social inequality and corporate biases condensed into a single gaze. Finally, Peter extended his hand. "For Mrs. Amelia," he said. Richard shook his hand firmly. "For a better future," he replied. As the attendees began to disperse, Eleanor approached Richard. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "we need to lose everything to find our true purpose." "But this is only the beginning, Mr. Thompson. There's still much more at stake than you realize." Richard nodded, realizing that this meeting wasn't an ending, but the start of something far greater. And as he watched Peter speaking with his colleagues, he began to understand that his true journey of redemption was just beginning. The first week of working together between Richard and Peter was a lesson in contrasts and discoveries. The makeshift office in the Hope Gardens Community Center bore no resemblance to the luxurious corporate facilities Richard was accustomed to. The peeling walls and noisy fan created a setting that forced him to see reality from a new perspective. "These are the families who will be directly impacted by the project," Peter explained, spreading dozens of files across the simple wooden table. "Every number in our reports has a face, a story." Richard examined the documents with renewed focus. They were no longer just statistics on a spreadsheet, but real lives. Mrs. Maria from 47, who had maintained a community garden for 2 decades. Mr. John from 123, a carpenter who taught his craft to the neighborhood youth. Mrs. Carmen from the bakery, who provided bread at half price for families in need. "How could we have overlooked all this in the initial analyses?" murmured Richard, more to himself than to Peter. "You didn't overlook it," replied Peter, his tone surprisingly gentle. "You simply didn't know how to look. It's different." As they walked through the neighborhood's narrow streets, Richard noticed something curious. Several of the social initiatives they encountered had a discreet plaque with the Grand Corp logo. They were small but meaningful projects. A community, library, a vocational training workshop, a daycare center. "Eleanor started these projects 5 years ago," explained Peter, noticing his interest. "After her mother, well, after the incident. But few in the company know about it. She keeps it all under the radar." Back at Grand Corp's main office, Claire Rogers intercepted Richard with intriguing news. "Something strange is going on," she whispered, pulling him into an empty room. "Robert Mendelsohn, the CFO, has been asking questions about you, and they're not friendly questions." Robert Mendelsohn was known for his aggressive business stance and his closeness to Richard's former corporate group. His sudden curiosity couldn't be a coincidence. "He had a closed-door meeting with Eleanor yesterday," Claire continued. "He left furious, saying something about sentimental projects hurting the company's results." Richard frowned. The restructuring plan for the Dawn project had been unanimously approved by the board. Why the sudden resistance? The answer began to take shape during a follow-up meeting with Eleanor. She seemed more tense than usual, her fingers drumming absent-mindedly on the table as Richard presented the progress updates. "Robert brought some concerns to the board," she said after the presentation. "He believes we are straying too far from our core mission as a company." "And what do you think?" Richard asked. Eleanor smiled enigmatically. "I think it's time for you to meet the Phoenix Project." She led him to an elevator Richard had never noticed before, hidden in a side corridor. It required a special key to access. They descended 2 floors below the ground level, arriving at an area that wasn't on any building blueprint. "Welcome to the true heart of Grand Corp," Eleanor announced, opening the doors to a stunning space. It was an entire complex dedicated to social projects. Dozens of people worked at different stations, coordinating initiatives ranging from microloans for small entrepreneurs to technology education programs for underserved communities. "This is my mother's legacy," Eleanor explained, her voice carrying rare emotion. "Every project here was born from a promise I made to her, to turn pain into purpose, regret into action, Richard observed the maps on the walls, showing dozens of communities impacted by the projects. On one mural, he recognized old photos, among them one showing Peter, younger, receiving a course completion certificate. "Did Robert find out about this?" Richard asked, beginning to grasp the scale of the conflict. "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "And he represents a group of shareholders who believe these projects are a waste of resources. They want a change in the company's direction. And you, Richard, unknowingly, have become a central piece in this battle." "How so?" "Your transformation," she explained. "Your ability to change and embrace a new vision for business is the proof I need to show that it's possible to align profit and purpose. But it's also exactly what they fear." An employee discreetly approached, handing an envelope to Eleanor. She opened it, her face hardening as she read the contents. "Robert has called an extraordinary board meeting for next week," she announced. "He wants to review all the company's social projects, including the Dawn project." Richard felt the weight of the revelation. It was no longer just about an urban development project or his personal redemption. It was a battle for the soul of the company, for Mrs. Amelia's legacy, and for a different way of doing business. "What do we do now?" he asked. Eleanor tucked the envelope away, her eyes gleaming with determination. "Now, Mr. Thompson, you'll understand why I brought you to GrandCorp. It's time to show that the true value of a company cannot be measured by numbers alone." As they ascended back into the corporate world above, Richard realized he was in the middle of something far bigger than he had imagined. The real battle was just beginning, and he would need all the help he could get, including Peter and his community, to face what was coming. The weekend leading up to the board meeting turned Hope Gardens into an unlikely hub of corporate strategy. In the small room of the community center, Richard, Peter, and a dedicated team worked tirelessly, preparing a presentation that could define the future not only of the neighborhood, but of all of GrandCorp. "We need to show more than numbers," Peter insisted, organizing video testimonials from residents. "They need to see the real impact of these projects." Claire Rogers, who had voluntarily joined the group over the weekend, added, "Robert Mendelsohn is already rallying support among the board members. I heard he has meetings scheduled with at least 5 of them before the meeting." Richard looked over the materials spread across the makeshift table when a particular photo caught his attention. It was an old picture of the neighborhood showing a community celebration. In the corner of the photo, partially visible, was a woman he recognized immediately. It was the same lady he had ignored on that rainy night. "Mrs. Amelia used to come here often," a voice behind him explained. It was Michael Carter, who no one had noticed entering the room. She believed that companies have a greater responsibility than just generating profits. "Why are you showing me this now?" Richard questioned. Michael adjusted his glasses with a calm smile. "Because you need to understand that you're fighting for something bigger than your own redemption, Mr. Thompson. You're fighting for the dream of someone who saw beyond the obvious." At that moment, Eleanor Grand entered the room, surprising everyone with her presence on a Sunday. Her usually composed face showed unusual concern. "Robert isn't alone in this battle," she announced after greeting everyone. "I've just discovered that he has connections to your former business group, Mr. Thompson." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "Charles Augustus?" "Exactly," confirmed Eleanor. "It seems his downfall wasn't as accidental as we thought. Robert and Charles have been planning something similar for GrandCorp for months. Your presence here, though orchestrated by me, ended up accelerating their plans." The revelation hit the room like a bombshell. Peter, who was organizing documents near the window, stepped closer with renewed interest. "So it's not just about profits versus social projects," he concluded. "It's an attempt to take control of the company." "And use my presence as justification," added Richard, the pieces falling into place in his mind. "My tainted record would be proof that the company is making misguided decisions." Eleanor walked to the window, observing the neighborhood activity outside. Children were playing soccer on an improvised field next to one of GrandCorp's community libraries. "My mother always said that the true character of a person or a company is revealed in the small gestures, the choices we make when no one is watching," she said, her voice carrying a mix of nostalgia and determination. "The Phoenix Project isn't just a secret social responsibility department. It's proof that we can do business differently." Claire, who had been analyzing financial documents, suddenly stood up. "I found something," she announced, spreading papers across the table. "Robert has been using a subsidiary of the company to divert funds from social projects over the past few months. Small amounts, hard to detect individually, but they add up to millions." "And that's not all," added Michael, pulling a flash drive from his pocket. "Eleanor, remember that file you asked me to investigate? Well, I found out that Robert had a secret meeting with foreign investors last week. They're planning a hostile takeover after discrediting the current administration." Richard observed the group gathered there. Eleanor Grand, the powerful CEO with a heart larger than her empire. Peter Smith, the community leader who turned a night of compassion into a life of purpose. Claire Rogers, the brilliant analyst who chose the right side of history. Michael Carter, the silent guardian of Grand Corp's secrets. Each of them represented a different piece of the puzzle he was now beginning to fully understand. "We can't just defend ourselves," Richard finally said. "We need to show the board that the true value of Grand Corp lies precisely in what Robert wants to destroy." "And how do we do that?" asked Peter. "By uniting the two worlds," replied Richard, a plan beginning to form in his mind. "We'll turn the board meeting into something they've never seen before. It won't just be a presentation of numbers and projects. It will be a meeting of realities," Eleanor completed, a smile of understanding appearing on her face. "Richard, I think you finally understood the true lesson I was trying to teach you." As the sun set over Hope Gardens, the group began working on a strategy that could not only save Grand Corp's social projects, but also redefine the meaning of corporate success. The battle would be tough, but for the first time, Richard felt he was truly on the right side of history. The morning before the board meeting began with a surprising discovery. Claire Rogers burst into Richard's office before the sun had even risen, carrying an old, dusty folder. "You need to see this," she said, breathless. "I spent the whole night, found the archives after noticing something strange in Robert's documents." Richard, who had barely slept preparing his presentation, examined the papers Claire spread across his desk. They were old records from Grand Corp, dated 5 years ago. "This subsidiary Robert is using to divert funds. She was created on the same day Mrs. Amelia had the accident," explained Claire, pointing to the dates. "And look who signed as a witness on the incorporation contract." The name of Charles Augustus, her former partner, jumped out from the yellowed document. Richard felt his stomach churn. "But there's more," Claire continued. "I found records of periodic transfers from this subsidiary to an account in the Cayman Islands. The transfers started exactly 1 month after Mrs. Amelia's accident. At that moment, Michael Carter entered the room, his usually calm face marked by concern. "Eleanor wants to see both of you immediately," he announced. "Peter is already in her office. Something has happened." In Eleanor's office, the atmosphere was tense. Peter was sitting in one of the armchairs holding a manila envelope. Eleanor was pacing back and forth, something Richard had never seen her do before. "Show them," Eleanor said as soon as Richard and Claire entered. Peter opened the envelope and pulled out some photographs. "These were taken on the night of Mrs. Amelia's accident," he explained. "One of the neighborhood residents was an amateur photographer and used to document the street activity. He kept these photos all these years. The images showed the scene Richard remembered. The rainy night, Mrs. Amelia lying on the sidewalk. But there was more. In one of the photos, partially hidden in the shadows, was Robert Mendelsohn watching the scene. "He was there," murmured Richard. "He saw it all happen." "And it wasn't a coincidence," Eleanor added, finally stopping her restless pacing. "Robert was the financial director of the bank that financed the expansion of your former business group, Mr. Thompson. He personally approved the loans that allowed your questionable operations." Claire, who was examining the photos, let out an exclamation. "There's someone else in these images, look." In another photo, further in the background, Charles Augustus could be seen stepping out of a luxury car. "They were following me," Richard realized. "That night they were already planning my downfall. And they used the situation with my mother for something even bigger, Eleanor added. The creation of the subsidiary, the embezzlement, it was all part of a long-term plan to take control of GrandCorp. Peter, who had remained silent, stood up and walked over to the frame containing Mrs. Amelia's photo. She discovered something, didn't she? He asked Eleanor. That's why she had the accident that night. Eleanor nodded slowly. My mother was more than a philanthropist. She was a relentless investigator of corporate misconduct. That night, she was returning from a meeting with an informant. She had uncovered the scheme Robert and Charles were planning. And now they want to use my presence in the company to discredit your leadership, Richard concluded. Make it seem like you're making emotional decisions, jeopardizing the future of GrandCorp. A heavy silence fell over the room. The morning sun began to stream through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed to symbolize the gravity of the moment. The board meeting is in 4 hours, Claire reminded them. What do we do with this information? Eleanor walked to her desk and pressed a button on the phone. Michael, please call everyone involved in the Phoenix project to the underground conference room, immediately. Turning to the group, her eyes shone with renewed determination. Let's change our strategy. It won't just be about defending the social projects. It will be the moment to expose a conspiracy that has been going on for 5 years. But we need to be careful, Richard warned. Robert and Charles are dangerous. They have powerful connections. That's exactly why we need to act now, Eleanor replied. Every minute that passes is a minute they can use to get ahead of us. As the group prepared to leave the room, Eleanor called Richard back. Mr. Thompson, she said, her voice softening, when I brought you into GrandCorp, it was because I saw in you the potential for change. Now I need you to use all your knowledge of the corporate world, all your understanding of how people like Robert think, to help us protect my mother's legacy. Richard looked at the photo of Mrs. Amelia. Once more, I won't let her down, Eleanor, not this time. The group left the office with a clear mission. In the next few hours, they needed to turn 5 years of conspiracies and secrets into a presentation that would not only save GrandCorp, but also bring justice to a woman who had given her life fighting for a more ethical corporate world. The boardroom of GrandCorp had never seemed more imposing than it did that morning. The 16 seats around the massive mahogany table were filled one by powerful figures from the corporate world. The sunlight streaming through the enormous glass panels created a play of light and shadow that seemed to divide the room into 2 distinct sides. Robert Mendelsohn was already in his seat, exuding a confidence that made the other board members naturally gravitate toward him. Beside him, an empty chair awaited a special guest he himself had requested for the meeting. Eleanor Grand entered last, accompanied by Richard, Peter, and Claire. The presence of the community leader caused an immediate stir among the more conservative board members. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, Eleanor began, her firm voice filling the room, before we officially begin this extraordinary meeting, I would like to introduce... Excuse me, Robert interrupted, standing up. I also have someone to introduce. Please come in. All heads turned toward the door. Charles Augustus, Richard Thompson's former partner, entered the room with his characteristic calculated smile. Richard felt his body tense but maintained his composure. As an independent financial consultant, announced Robert, Mr. Charles Augustus is here to share his expertise on the risks of mixing sentimentality with business. Eleanor kept her expression neutral, only nodding slightly to Richard. It was the signal they had agreed upon. Before any presentation, said Richard, standing up, I would like to share some relevant information with the board. He gestured, and Claire began distributing folders to the board members. Charles visibly paled upon seeing the contents. What you have in your hands, Richard continued, is the complete documentation of a conspiracy that began 5 years ago, exactly on the day Mrs. Amelia Grand suffered an alleged accident. Robert stood up abruptly. This is absurd. This meeting was called to discuss the financial viability of the social projects, not to discuss how you and Charles have been diverting funds through a shell company, Claire interjected, projecting documents onto the main screen, or to reveal how you planned Richard Thompson's downfall as a rehearsal for something bigger. The silence that followed was deafening. The board members flipped through the documents with expressions ranging from shock to outrage. Eleanor stood up calmly. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you are seeing is just the tip of the iceberg. Peter, please." Peter walked to the center of the room carrying photographs from the night of the accident. These images show that it was no coincidence. Robert Mendelssohn and Charles Augustus were present on the night Mrs. Amelia was found injured. The same night she discovered the scheme they were planning. "This is ridiculous," protested Charles. "They can't prove anything." "Actually," interjected Michael Carter, entering the room quietly with a notebook, "we can prove everything. Mrs. Amelia kept meticulous records she entrusted to me on the morning of that day." The tension in the room was palpable. Robert, realizing his plan was beginning to crumble, tried one last move. Even if there were some irregularities," he said, forcing a conciliatory tone, "that doesn't change the fact that the social projects are consuming valuable company resources. The shareholders would like to know," interrupted Eleanor, "that the Phoenix Project, our social responsibility program, generated a 27% return on investment last year through tax benefits, brand strengthening, and the development of new markets." Richard spoke up again, his voice carrying a conviction that even surprised Eleanor. "Gentlemen of the board, I stand before you today not just as a former CEO who lost everything, but as someone who learned the hard way that the true value of a company is not measured solely by the numbers on its balance sheet." He paused, looking directly at Charles and Robert. "I was like you. I believed the ends justified the means, that people were just resources, that communities were merely obstacles to be removed. I was wrong." Peter then began to present the real results of the social projects. Lives transformed, communities strengthened, talents discovered. Each slide, each number, each personal story was living proof that the business model championed by Eleanor was not only ethically sound, but also financially solid. The meeting stretched on for hours, with increasingly shocking revelations. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the boardroom, it became clear that this day would mark a fundamental shift not only for Grand Corp, but for the lives of everyone present. The real battle, however, was just beginning. The sun had already set when the board chairman Arthur Drummond, a grey-haired man with a stern expression, finally spoke after hours of presentations and heated debates. "In 25 years presiding over this board," he began, adjusting his tortoiseshell glasses, "I have never witnessed a situation like this. The evidence presented is disturbing, to say the least." Robert Mendelssohn remained in his seat, his face a mask of false calm, while Charles Augustus couldn't hide his nervousness, repeatedly adjusting his expensive tie. "Before we make any decisions," Arthur continued, "I would like to hear from Mrs. Grand. Eleanor, why did you keep the Phoenix Project a secret for so long?" Eleanor stood up slowly, her eyes scanning every face in the room. "Because some seeds need shade to grow, Mr. Drummond. My mother taught me that true change doesn't happen with grand announcements or impressive reports. It happens in silence, in consistency, in the genuine transformation of lives." Peter then stepped forward, carrying one last folder. "If I may," he said, his firm voice echoing through the room, "there's something else you need to see." He distributed the final documents, a detailed analysis showing how Grand Corp's social projects had created an invisible safety net during the last economic crisis, keeping the company stable while competitors faced turmoil. "The communities we supported," Peter explained, "became not just beneficiaries but partners. When the market slowed down, it was they who kept our products in circulation, who defended our brand, who ensured our sustainability." Richard observed the board members, absorbing the information. Years of corporate experience allowed him to read their expressions. They were impressed not just by the results, but by the depth of the vision. It was then that Claire noticed something strange. Robert had discreetly pulled a flash drive from his pocket and connected it to his laptop. "Eleanor," she whispered urgently, but it was too late. The screens in the meeting room flickered, and suddenly a series of documents began to project. They were old records from the time when Richard led his business group, manipulated to make it seem as though Eleanor had been aware of and involved in his questionable operations. "As you can see," Robert announced, standing up with a triumphant smile, "Mrs. Grand is not as upright as she wants to appear. She knew about Mr. Thompson's operations for years and chose to bring him into the company anyway." The board fell into a tense silence. But before panic could set in, Michael Carter stepped forward. "Interesting presentation, Mr. Mendelssohn." "Mendelssohn," he said, his voice calm as ever, "but I fear you are not the only one who kept records." With a command on his own notebook, Michael projected a series of emails and messages exchanged between Robert and Charles over the years. The conversations revealed not only the conspiracy against Richard, but also a much broader plan to take control of various companies through similar financial manipulations. "This is unacceptable," protested Charles, standing up. "These messages are private." "Just as private as Mrs. Amelia's records were," replied Eleanor, her voice carrying restrained emotion. "Records you tried to destroy that night, but which she had entrusted to people who shared her vision of a more ethical corporate world." Arthur Drummond raised his hand, silencing the room. "I believe we have enough information to make a decision." He looked at the other board members, who nodded in agreement. "Robert Mendelssohn and Charles Augustus are immediately removed from any position or influence at Grand Corp. The evidence will be forwarded to the appropriate authorities." He paused, turning to Eleanor. "As for the Phoenix Project and other social initiatives, the board not only approves their continuation, but recommends their expansion." The tension in the room began to dissipate. Robert and Charles were escorted out by security, their expressions of defeat contrasting with the confidence they had displayed hours earlier. Eleanor approached Richard, who was watching the scene with a mix of relief and reflection. "You know," she said softly, "when I brought you to Grand Corp, it wasn't just to help you redeem yourself. It was because I knew we would need someone who understood the other side to help us fight it." Peter joined them, a subtle smile on his face. "And now, what happens to the Dawn Project?" Eleanor looked out the window where the city lights were beginning to shine in the falling night. "Now we begin the real work, no longer in the shadows but in the light of day." As the last board members left the room, Richard realized that this was not just the end of a battle. It was the beginning of a new era at Grand Corp. An era that would prove that business success and social responsibility could not only coexist, but were, in fact, inseparable. 6 months had passed since the meeting that changed the course of Grand Corp. On a sunny spring morning, Richard was observing the activity in Hope Gardens from the window of his new office. The neighborhood had changed, not just because of the renewed infrastructure brought by the Dawn Project, but also because of the sense of community that now pulsed on every corner. "Deep in thought?" asked Eleanor, entering the room without ceremony. Since Richard had taken over the now expanded Phoenix Project, their conversations had become more frequent and less formal. "Just reflecting on how things have changed," Ewa replied, gesturing to the chair in front of him. "You know, earlier today I met an elderly lady who needed help carrying her groceries. I didn't think twice before helping her." Eleanor smiled, understanding the significance of that seemingly simple gesture. "Small choices shape who we become," she said, placing an old folder on the table. "Speaking of which, I found something. You should see." Inside the folder was a handwritten letter from Mrs. Amelia, dated just a few days before the accident. In it, she described her vision for Grand Corp, not just as a company, but as a catalyst for positive change in society. "My mother believed that a company's true legacy wasn't in its profits, but in the lives it touched," explained Eleanor. "That's why she tirelessly investigated questionable corporate practices, not out of revenge, but because she believed there could be a better way." The door opened again and Peter entered, accompanied by Claire. Both were carrying the latest analyses of the company's social project's impact. "The numbers are impressive," announced Claire, spreading charts across the table. "Grand Corp's model is being studied by universities and replicated by other companies. We're creating a new paradigm in the corporate world." Peter added, "And that's not all. The Vocational Training Center has already graduated over 200 young people. 3 of them were even hired for important positions within the company. Richard examined the reports with a smile. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were stories of transformation, of lives changed, of renewed hopes. Michael told me you turned down an offer to return as the head of your former business group, commented Eleanor, watching him closely. Some promotions are actually steps backward, replied Richard. I've learned that success isn't measured by the height of the position or the size of the bank account. At that moment, Michael Carter entered the room carrying a framed photograph. It was the image from the day of the inauguration of the new community center in Hope Gardens, with Richard, Peter, and Eleanor standing alongside dozens of smiling residents. This one's going in the presidential gallery, announced Michael, next to the portrait of Mrs. Amelia. Eleanor gently touched the photograph, her eyes misty. You know what's most incredible? That all of this started with small choices. A young delivery boy who decided to stop and help, an executive who chose to honor her mother's legacy, and a man who, without even knowing it, was about to discover his true purpose. Richard stood up and walked to the window again. Down below, life continued its course in the transformed neighborhood. Children played in the new park, elderly residents chatted on the benches of the revitalized square, and young people came and went from the training center. You know what's funny? He said, his voice carrying a mix of nostalgia and gratitude. I spent years building an empire based on numbers, transactions, and power, but I've never felt as fulfilled as I do now, seeing the real impact we can have on people's lives. Claire, who was analyzing the latest data, added, and the most impressive part is that the company has never been financially healthier. We've proven that it's possible to do good and do it well. This is just the beginning, said Eleanor, joining Richard at the window. There's still so much work ahead, so many lives to transform, so many bridges to build. Peter approached the group, carrying a new project proposal. Speaking of building bridges, what do you think about expanding the model to other neighborhoods? We already have communities interested in replicating the success of Hope Gardens. Richard looked at his companions on this journey, Eleanor with her transformative vision, Peter with his tireless dedication, Claire with her competence and integrity, Michael with his quiet wisdom. Each of them had contributed to his transformation, to his rebirth as a human being. You know, he said, in all my years in the corporate world, I've learned thousands of lessons about business. But the most valuable lesson I learned here, that true success isn't in what we achieve for ourselves, but in what we build for others. The morning sun lit up the room, casting a golden glow on the photograph of Mrs. Amelia on the wall. Her serene smile seemed to approve of the new path the company had chosen, a path she had always dreamed could be possible. As the group gathered to plan the next steps, Richard realized that his journey of redemption had turned into something much greater. It was no longer about fixing past mistakes, but about building a better future, a future where business and humanity not only coexisted, but strengthened each other. And so, on that ordinary morning that felt special, Grand Corp continued its mission to prove that, in the end, the greatest profit a company can generate is the positive transformation in people's lives.